Hi, I'm Kacie, a longtime Maryland resident, and I serve on the board of Women's Liberation Front, or WoLF. We're a national feminist nonprofit which fights for the rights of women and girls. We strongly oppose SB 550. This bill is modeled on California's SB 132, which WoLF is challenging in federal civil rights lawsuit. Since being implemented a year ago, they have seen a 30% increase in incarcerated people identifying as transgender. There have been nearly 300 requests for transfer from men's to women's facilities, 1/3 of which are from registered sex offenders. The law does not disqualify those who may pose a danger, and yet the Bureau of Prisons reports that 48% of trans-identified federal inmates are sex offenders. Men who transfer are also not required to take hormones or have surgery, although a long-term study shows that makes no difference in male patterns of criminality. Over 90% of them retain their penises. They are being housed in cells with women, which has already led to voyeurism, brutal assault, and rape. These are men who molested and murdered children and beat their male cellmates to death. Condoms and birth control are being distributed, and women are being counseled on options if they get pregnant. As a lesbian, the thought of being incarcerated with men makes chills run down my spine. And under this bill, they can transfer even if they don't claim to have a female gender identity, and can choose an identity at any time, even while incarcerated, and there are no fail-safes or criteria to decide who has a legitimate identity. Identifying as non-binary, gender fluid, or transgender does not change your biological sex. This fringe notion, based on sex stereotypes, will be one of the greatest embarrassments of our time. I would laugh this bill if the consequences weren't so sickening. Please oppose.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the chance to testify. My name is Jennifer Chavez, and I've lived in Maryland for 13 years. I oppose SB 550 because it allows any incarcerated male access to vulnerable female incarcerated women simply by claiming that he self-identifies as a woman or non-binary, no matter what crime he committed. Gender identity is completely subjective and therefore unfalsifiable, but being female is a hard reality. Females on average are smaller and substantially weaker than males. Only females can become pregnant through rape. A large majority of incarcerated women are already carrying trauma from physical or abuse in the past, and a greater percentage of women are carrying that trauma than men. Over 42% of incarcerated women are lesbian or bisexual, and these women are already 10 times more likely to be sexually victimized within jails. So why would anyone want to add more danger to their lives? The language in this bill is far from a so-called fail-safe. First of all, it mandates that staff shall consider the inmate's health or safety and even his own subjective, quote, perception of health and safety. The only exception is vaguely worded and completely discretionary for specific and articulable management or security concerns. But this language is practically meaningless because any male should present that kind of concern in a women's facility, but also it's important to know that similar, almost exact language in California has failed to stop convicted murderers and rapists doing lifetime sentences from being transferred into the women's facility. So these are not abstract fears. Women should never be used as human shields. Please return an unfavorable report.
Questions from the committee? Senator Carter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Either one of, I think the first witness, you testified about the lawsuit. That's the lawsuit that I just pulled it up on the internet, but I haven't had time to read all through it. But it's just a filed lawsuit. It hasn't been, there's been no determinations in that lawsuit yet, correct?
Correct.
And so, you know, I'm not sure. Maybe there's language in the legislation that we have here that could be tightened up. But some of the things you testified to sound horrific. But I would imagine that the current protocols that already exist in the prison facilities that are always to consider inmate safety, like all inmate safety, would come into play. So in no way would this bill to be to supersede other determinations of inmate safety. It would be a consideration of the inmate that is being an intake in the context of all of the other inmates as well. So what you said is just a little confusing, because it sounds like in the California situation, they're not using any protocols at all. Are you aware? Are they using any protocols, or are they just, that seems like it's, from what you testified to, it just seems like it's reckless or negligent. It doesn't seem like it has anything to do with this bill.
I'd be happy to field that question. I am on the advisory council of the organization that has brought this lawsuit on behalf of incarcerated women in California. And Senator, with respect, I want to emphasize that this bill is worded almost the same as the California bill. It's really not substantially different in any way. It doesn't have any additional safeguards. I want to share with you some of the actual examples of inmates who have made it into the women's facilities under the same language. Anthony Lipsy, serving life for murder.
Asking is, are there any protocols that are being used at the facility at all? I already said maybe there's language here that be tightened up. But what I'm saying to you is, from what you're suggesting, the facilities are using like no criteria at all. For example, even if there is no issue whatsoever of gender identity or transgender, sex offenders are supposed to be housed in places that are safe for the other inmates, regardless of anything to do with gender identity.
Okay, no, it would not be correct to say that there are no protocols. There have been a small number of males who've been rejected for transfer. I couldn't tell you the details of why they've been rejected. However, I think the more pertinent fact is that we have rapists and murderers who did make it through that process. And of course, the reasoning would be, well, you have female rapists and murderers in this facility, so you can't discriminate against me just because I happen to have a penis and they don't. So this bill explicitly rules out that kind of reasoning. And, there are no categorical exclusions under this bill. There's no class of crimes or no even vague description of a type of class of crimes that would serve to exclude any male from gaining access to the women's facilities.
I'm repeating, definitely amenable if there could be, there's a real problem here too, that we articulated in our testimony. And so amenable to language that could basically tighten up our bill to prevent the kind of things that you've described. But what I find shocking, and I don't see where this bill would enhance the opportunities for people that are just blatantly lying, that have never identified whatsoever in any way, shape, or form as a woman, to suddenly, after they have a sex offender background, go to the prison facility administrators and say, hey, I want to change to be with the women. Like, to me, that just doesn't sound reasonable, because there's no, looking at the criteria, the totality of the circumstances, I just can't imagine that would be a decision that would be made.
I agree that would be completely unreasonable, but the very nature of gender identity is that you really can't ask questions about sincerity. First of all, by definition, it's completely subjective. So it depends entirely on a person's, not just their feelings, but their claims about their feelings. And the other thing I want to offer in terms of, your allusion to alternatives, trans-identified males in Maryland jails already have statutory protections in the men's facilities. So why not look to strengthen those protections there in the men's facilities? All men deserve protection from violence at the hands of other males. It shouldn't even be a last resort, but certainly shouldn't be a first resort. The only apparent intention behind this bill to put men in women's facilities rather than in men's is to affirm their identities. That's just not a strong enough reason to materially increase the extraordinary risk of violence and sexual assault to women in women's facilities.
Really continue this conversation offline because I don't want to take the committee's time all day with back and forth. But in reality, there's a serious stigma attached to being transgender, and many people that are transgender go through a lot of emotional turmoil. They, as we testify to, they are far more likely to suffer ridicule, humiliation, physical abuse, sexual abuse. And so what I'm struggling with is that all of that is completely being ignored by some men that are sex offenders, and they just choose to identify as transgender. That just doesn't seem that reasonable, but I'm happy to have the conversation. And I'll also take a look at what's going on in California and see
Please do.
the onboard details.
Please do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Chavez. You submitted written testimony, and you have lots of citations, so thank you for that. Ms. Mills, you rattled off a number of numbers and statistics that I think would be important for the committee to consider, but we were not in receipt of written testimony from you. I wonder if it's possible if you could furnish the committee with some of the data that you cited during your oral testimony. Excellent. Thank you very much.